The massive doors of the Proxima Station courthouse hissed open, revealing a chamber that seemed designed to crush the spirit of anyone who entered. Crystal walls stretched impossibly high, their surfaces pulsing with alien script that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Li Han walked slowly down the center aisle, his mining boots echoing against the polished floor that reflected the harsh blue light from above. The accident had happened 3 days ago in the deep tunnels of asteroid belt mining Station 7. A support beam had collapsed during the night shift, crushing 3 Vorthan workers instantly. Li had been the shift supervisor, responsible for safety protocols that everyone knew were outdated. The Vorthan Empire didn't care about updating equipment for lesser species worksites. Now he stood in their court, surrounded by beings from across the galaxy. To his left sat a family of Elthians, their grey skin glistening with nervous sweat as they clutched their children close. Behind them, a group of insectoid Krytash workers clicked their mandibles anxiously. Everyone knew the rules here. Everyone knew what was expected. The High Judge's platform rose from the floor like a mountain of polished obsidian. Judge Velter himself was a towering figure, even by Vorthan standards, his blue skin marked with the silver tattoos of ancient nobility. His forearms moved in ritualistic patterns as he prepared to begin proceedings. Round his platform, floating security drones hummed with barely contained energy, their red sensor eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of defiance. All beings will now show proper respect to the High Court of Vorthan Justice, announced the court officer, a smaller Vorthan whose voice carried the authority of centuries of tradition. Assume the position of submission before His Honor Judge Velter. The sound was like a wave washing over the courtroom. Hundreds of beings dropped to their knees, then pressed their faces to the cold floor. Humans, Althians, Krytash, even the proud crystalline traders from the Outer Rim, will bend their bodies in forced humility. The rustle of clothing, the soft thud of knees hitting stone, the whispered prayers in a dozen languages, all blended into the symphony of submission that the Vorthan Empire had orchestrated across the galaxy. But one sound was missing. One man remained upright. Li Han sat in the defendant's chair, his withered hands folded calmly in his lap. At 63 years old, he had spent most of his life working in the mines. First on Earth during the occupation, then on distant worlds after humanity was granted worker status in the galactic community. His face was lined with years of breathing recycled air, and his back was bent from decades of hard labor. But his eyes held something that made the Vorthan guards shift uncomfortably, human Li Han. The court officer's voice carried a note of confusion. You will rise and show respect to High Judge Velter. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the lone figure who remained seated. Li could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of fear and curiosity radiating from the crowd. Some of the younger humans looked at him with something approaching hope, while the older ones shook their heads in terror, knowing what defiance meant in Vorthan courts. Judge Velter's massive head turned toward Li, his golden eyes narrowing to slits. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the chamber like distant thunder. The human will comply with court protocol immediately. Li's response was barely above a whisper. But in the absolute silence of the courtroom, it carried to every corner. I will not bow. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Security drones swooped down from their hovering positions. Their energy fields crackled to life, casting eerie shadows across the crystal walls. The Althian family huddled closer together, their children beginning to cry. Several Krytash workers clicked their mandibles in what might have been approval or terror, but Li remained motionless, even as the restraint fields began to form round him. The energy barriers pressed against his skin like invisible hands, lifting him from his chair. His weathered fingers reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph. its edges worn smooth from years of handling. The image showed a young Korean woman, maybe 19 years old, standing in front of a crowd of humans. Her face was defiant, her chin raised high despite the Vorthan soldiers surrounding her. Kim So-ra had been everything to Lee, his only daughter, his pride and joy. She had been a university student when the Vorthans first arrived on Earth, studying literature and dreaming of becoming a teacher. Instead, she had become a symbol. You see this? Lee called out as the restraint fields began to drag him toward the holding area. His voice carried across the stunned courtroom. This is my daughter, Kim So-ra. 20 years ago, she stood in a square on Earth and refused to kneel before your kind. We executed her for it, shot her down like an animal for the crime of standing upright. The security drones moved faster now, their humming growing louder as they attempted to silence him. But Lee's voice rose above the mechanical noise. She died standing up. He continued, clutching the photograph against his chest. And I'll be damned if I'm going to dishonor her memory by crawling before anyone. As the restraint fields carried him from the courtroom, Lee looked back at the sea, of faces still pressed against the floor. In their eyes, he saw something that hadn't been there before. A spark, a question, a tiny flame of rebellion that would soon spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The massive doors slammed shut behind him, but the revolution had already begun. The detention cell on Proxima Station was a cube of pure energy, its walls humming with a low frequency that made human bones ache. Lehan sat on the single metal bench, still clutching the worn photograph of his daughter. The restraint fields had been removed, but he knew that stepping too close to any wall would trigger the pain sensors built into the containment system. Park Jin-woo arrived 3 hours after the incident, his legal briefcase clutched tightly. In his hands, the young lawyer had been assigned to defend humans in the outer colonies for 2 years now. But he had never seen anything like what happened in that courtroom. His hands shook as the Vorthan guards led him through the security checkpoint, their blue faces showing nothing but contempt for another human who dared to walk upright in their presence. "You crazy old man," Park whispered as he entered the cell, his voice barely audible above the energy field's hum. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lee looked up at him with tired eyes, then held out the photograph. Park took it with trembling fingers, studying the image of the young woman who had become a legend among Earth's resistance fighters. Kim So-ra stood in the center of what humans called Liberation Square, her arms raised high while Vorthan soldiers surrounded her with their plasma weapons drawn. She was just a kid, Lee said quietly, studying Korean literature at Seoul University when they came. She used to read me poems over video calls when I was working the Saturn mines. Beautiful words about mountains and freedom. Park sang canto, the bench beside his client, staring at the photograph. Every human in the colonies knew the story of Kim So-ra, but seeing her father's weathered face beside her image made the history feel suddenly relearned. Immediate, the Vorthans offered her a choice. Lee continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Kneel in the square, apologize for organizing the protests, and they would let her live. She looked right at their commander and said, "Humans weren't born to crawl like insects. We stand up, or we die trying." The lawyer's hands were shaking now as he held the photograph through the cell's transparent aluminum window. He could see the bustling activity of Proxima Station's main corridor. Alien traders moved in groups, their various species maintaining the careful hierarchies that kept the Vorthan Empire functioning. Humans walked with their heads down, carrying cargo and performing maintenance work that the superior species considered beneath them. They shot her down right there in the square, Lee whispered. But you know what happened next. Every human watching raised their hands to the sky, just like she had done. Thousands of them, all standing up together. Meanwhile, 50 light-years away on mining station Kepler-7, the quantum news networks were already buzzing with reports of the incident. Choi Min-ho was working the late shift in the asteroid processing facility when his personal communicator chimed with an urgent message from his cousin on Proxima Station. "You need to see this," the message read, followed by a grainy video recording of Lee Hyun's defiance in the courtroom. Min-ho was only 25. Part of the generation born after Earth's liberation, he had grown up hearing stories about the dignity protests, but they had always seemed like ancient history. Now, watching this old miner refuse to bow before the Vorthan judge, something awakened in his chest. He forwarded the video to every human worker on the station. Within hours, the mining facility's cafeteria was packed with off-duty workers huddled round portable screens, watching the footage over and over. When the Vorthan shift supervisor entered and demanded they assume submission positions for the evening inspection, something unprecedented happened. 3 workers remained standing, then 5, then the entire room. The supervisor's mandibles clicked in confusion as he stared at 40 humans who simply refused to kneel. His hand moved toward his communication device, but one of the workers, an older woman named Lee Ji-in, stepped forward. "We're not causing trouble," she said firmly. "We're just standing up." On Mars Colony, teacher Young Yoonji was preparing her mixed-species classroom for the daily loyalty ceremony when she received the quantum transmission. The video of Lee Han played on her tablet as 30 young beings, human and alien alike, watched in fascination. When it ended, she looked at her students and made a decision that would change everything. "Today, we're going to learn about a human concept," she announced, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "It's called dignity." The Vorthan education monitor, a tall blue figure who oversaw all colonial schools, entered the classroom just as Yong was explaining the difference between respect that was earned and submission that was forced. His golden eyes narrowed as he listened to her words. "Teacher Yong Yoonji," he commanded in his booming voice, "you will assume the position of respect immediately." Yong looked at her students. Seeing the mixture of fear and curiosity in their eyes, human children sat beside young Altheans and Krytash, all of them watching to see what she would do. She thought of Kim Sora, of Lee Han, of all the humans who had chosen dignity over safety. "I will not bow," she said simply. The classroom erupted in whispers as the Vorthan monitor's face darkened with rage. But before he could respond, something extraordinary happened. A young Althean student named Zephi stood up from his desk, his gray skin shimmering with nervous energy. "I won't bow either," the child said in his squeaky voice. Then a Krytash student clicked her mandibles and rose from her chair. One by one, the entire classroom of mixed-species children stood up together, their various forms creating a beautiful tapestry of rebellion. Back on Proxima Station, Park Jin-woo was preparing his defense strategy when his communicator exploded. With incoming messages, reports were flooding in from across 3 star systems. Humans were refusing to perform submission rituals. Some aliens were joining them. The word dignity was being translated into dozens of languages, even though many species had never had a concept for it before. The Vorthan Empire, which had ruled through fear and hierarchy for over 800 years, was facing something they had never encountered. Not a violent uprising or a military rebellion, but a simple refusal to accept their supposed superiority. In his cell, Lee Hyun smiled as he listened to Park read the reports. His daughter's sacrifice 20 years ago had planted a seed, and now that seed was growing into something the galaxy had never seen before. The revolution wouldn't be fought with weapons or ships. It would be fought by beings who simply chose to stand up and be counted as equals. The photograph of Kim So-rao seemed to glow in the artificial light of the detention cell. a defiant pose inspiring a new generation of freedom fighters across the stars. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in centuries. News drones from 17 different galactic networks hovered near the crystal ceiling. Their cameras focused on what many were calling the most important trial in Vorthan history. Representatives from the Galactic Trade Council sat in the premium viewing section, their various alien forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes across the upper galleries. Lehine walked back into the courtroom with his head held high, the restrained cuffs on his wrists seeming almost decorative compared to the chains of submission that had bound his people for decades. Park Jin-woo followed closely behind, his legal robes freshly pressed, but his hands still trembling from the reports flooding his communicator throughout the night. High Judge Velter loomed above them all like a blue mountain of ancient authority. His forearms moved in the traditional patterns of Vorthan justice, each gesture carrying the weight of 800 years of imperial rule. The security drones had been doubled since the previous day's incident, their red eyes scanning constantly for any sign of defiance. This court will resume proceedings in the matter of Human Lehine versus the Vorthan Mining Consortium, announced the bailiff, his voice echoing through the crystal chamber. All beings will now assume the position of respect before his honor. The familiar sound began again, the rustle of clothing and the soft impact of knees hitting the polished floor. But this time, something was different. Park Jin-woo, who had spent years being in this very courtroom, remained standing beside his client. His legs shook with fear, but his spine stayed straight. In the gallery, Engineer Osagin felt his heart pounding as he watched the young lawyer's act of defiance. Sajin had traveled from mining station Kepler 7 specifically to witness the trial, using his life savings to book passage on a freight hauler. He thought of his co-workers back home, all standing together in the cafeteria, and slowly rose to his feet. Dr. Namyori had been treating injured miners for 15 years across the outer colonies. She had seen too many humans broken by Vorthan discipline, too many families destroyed by their arbitrary justice. As she stood up in the medical observer section, her white coat seemed to glow under the harsh courtroom lights. The waves spread like ripples across the pond. Maintenance worker Kim Tae-sung stood up in the back row. Merchant Captain Lee Soo-jin rose from her seat near the press section. One by one, every human in the courtroom chose dignity over safety, creating a forest of upright figures in a sea of prostrated beings. The Vorthan court officers moved nervously between their positions, their plasma batons crackling with energy but unused. They had protocols for dealing with individual troublemakers, but nothing in their training covered what to do when an entire species simply refused to comply. High Judge Velter's golden eyes swept across the standing humans, his mandibles clicking, in a rhythm that spoke of barely controlled rage. But the revolution was just beginning. In the alien observer section, Althean Trader X-High had been watching the humans with growing fascination. His people had been among the first to submit to Vorthan rule 3 centuries ago, accepting their place in the hierarchy in exchange for trading privileges. But as he watched these humans stand with quiet determination, something stirred in his four-chambered heart. By the 7 moons of Althea, he whispered, then slowly unfolded his forearms and rose to his full 7-foot height. His gray skin shimmered with nervous energy, but his voice carried clearly across the courtroom. I stand with the humans. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed from every corner of the chamber as beings who had never seen an Althean defy Vorthan. Authority stared in shock. The news drones swooped closer, their cameras capturing every moment of this unprecedented display. To crystalline observers in the diplomatic section began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that translated roughly to agreement and solidarity. Their mineral bodies chimed like bells as they shifted from their traditional meditation poses to standing positions, their faceted surfaces reflecting the courtroom lights in brilliant patterns. A young Kritash student who had come to observe justice proceedings for her law studies clicked her mandibles uncertainly, then raised herself up on her 6 legs in a gesture that her species reserved for challenging territorial claims. The sound of her chitting filled the air as she declared in broken galactic standard, "Humans show us new way. I stand too." Even some of the Vorthan citizens in the upper galleries began to shift uncomfortably. A group of younger blue-skinned beings, students from the Proxima University who had come to study colonial law, exchanged uncertain glances. They had grown up hearing stories of Vorthan superiority. But watching this peaceful rebellion unfold before their eyes planted seeds of doubt about everything they had been taught. High Judge Velter's composure finally cracked. His massive fist slammed down on his judgment platform, creating a sound like thunder that made the crystal walls vibrate. "Silence," he roared, his voice amplified by the courtroom's acoustic systems. "You will all assume the position of respect immediately, or face the consequences of defying Vorthan justice." But his words fell on deaf ears. More beings were standing now, a family of free Betelgeuse refugees, a delegation of aquatic hydrants in their environmental suits, even a few brave Vorthan youngsters who had never questioned their empire's methods until this moment. The security drones began to move in formation, their energy fields charging with lethal intent. But there were too many targets now, too many beings spread across a wide area. The mathematical impossibility of subduing dozens of different species simultaneously without causing a massacre began to register in their simple AI minds. Park Jinwoo stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found his courage. "Your Honor," he said, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade, "I request that the court record show that my client's actions have inspired peaceful civil disobedience across multiple species. This is no longer about a mining accident or Vorthan law. This is about the fundamental right of all sentient beings to stand as equals." The judge's mandibles clicked furiously as he stared down at the young lawyer. Round them, the standing crowd had grown to nearly half the courtroom's occupants. The news drones broadcasted every moment across the galaxy, and reports were already coming in of similar demonstrations on dozens of worlds. Lehine looked round at the incredible sight surrounding him. His daughter's sacrifice had started, something that he never could have imagined. Beings who had never met, who couldn't even breathe the same air, were standing together in defiance of a system that had oppressed them for centuries. The revolution had begun, and it was spreading faster than hyperspace communication could carry the news. The simple human concept of dignity was about to change the galaxy forever. The quantum network spurned with activity as footage from Lihyun's trial spread across the galaxy faster than the speed of light, on cargo ships drifting between star systems. Crews huddled round holographic displays, watching the incredible moment when dozens of beings choose to stand together. The revolution was no longer contained to a single courtroom on Proxima Station. Kim Taehyung was loading deuterium containers onto a massive freight hauler at Kepler Station when his wrist communicato buzzed with the trial footage. The dock worker paused, his hydraulic loader arms still gripping a 2-ton crate, and watched as humans and aliens alike defied centuries of Vorthan authority round him. The busy spaceport continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures, but Taehyung felt something shift inside his chest. The morning shift change brought the usual ritual. Vorthan Dock Master Krelvoth emerged from his command tower, his blue skin gleaming under the artificial suns that lit the station's cargo bays. 300 workers from a dozen species immediately dropped to their knees on the metal deck, plating, their heads bowed as tradition demanded, but not Taehyung. He stood beside his loader, his withered hands gripping the controls, his eyes fixed on the distant stars visible through the transparent aluminum viewing ports. Human Kim Taehyung. Krelvoth's voice boomed across the dock through the translation. Speakers, you will assume the position of respect immediately. I respectfully decline, Taehyung replied, his voice steady despite the fear racing through his veins. The effect was electric. Other human workers began to lift their heads, looking at their colleague with mixtures of terror and admiration. Then, slowly, maintenance engineer Park Sung-min rose to his feet. Cargo specialist Lim Hai-won followed. Within minutes, the entire human workforce was standing upright, while beings from other species remained kneeled round them like islands in a sea of submission. Krelvoth's mandibles clicked furiously as he activated his emergency communicator, calling for security reinforcements. But the damage was already done. The image of humans standing tall while performing their duties spread through the station's internal networks, inspiring similar acts of defiance throughout the facility. Meanwhile, in the deep space between Proxima and the Centauri system, Captain Lee Soo-jin commanded a medium-class transport vessel carrying medical supplies to the outer colonies. Her crew of 18 humans had served together for 3 years, running cargo through some of the most dangerous sectors of Vorthan space. They were used to following orders and keeping their heads down. Everything changed when they received boarding orders from Vorthan battle cruiser Domination's Edge, the massive warship, bristling with plasma cannons and fighter bays, dwarfed Soo-jin's transport like a whale beside a minnow. Standard protocol demanded that all crew members prostrate themselves on the deck while Vorthan inspectors searched the vessel. Captain called out her first officer, Cho Min-soo. As the boarding tube connected with a metallic clang, I've been thinking about that trial footage, about what it means. Soo-jin nodded grimly. She had watched the recording 3 times, each viewing strengthening her resolve. When the airlock cycled open and Vorthan soldiers marched aboard, their plasma rifles gleaming under the ship's lights, she made her choice. Crew of transport vessel Harmony's Dream commanded the lead inspector, his voice mechanically translated through his helmet speakers. Assume submission positions for Imperial inspection. Soo-jin's crew looked to their captain, waiting for our decision. She thought of Rehan, of his daughter Kim Sora, of all the humans who had died for the simple right to stand upright. Then she crossed her arms and remained standing. We are in compliance with all shipping regulations, she stated clearly. But we will not bow. One by one, her crew joined her. Engineer Ko Jae-sung, Communications Officer Yu Yun-bai, even the youngest crew member, 19-year-old Nam Woo-jin, all chose dignity over safety. The Vorthan inspectors stood frozen, their weapons raised but uncertain how to proceed without creating an interstellar incident. The standoff lasted for hours. During that time, 6 other human ships in the area received similar boarding orders and made the same choice. The Vorthan fleet found itself paralyzed, unable to process cargo or conduct routine inspections because their authority was being quietly, peacefully rejected. The news reached Vorthan High Command within hours, carried by urgent military communications that spoke of system-wide human insubordination and coordinated resistance activity. Fleet Admiral Zarkin, a veteran of dozens of colonial suppression campaigns, responded with overwhelming force. Across 3 star systems, Vorthan military forces began mass arrests. Detention ships filled with humans who refused to bow during workplace inspections. Mining colonies were placed under martial law. Transport vessels were impounded, their crews sent to prison stations in the Outer Rim. But for every human they arrested, the movement grew stronger. On Titan Colony, teacher Seo Yi-jun organized a school walkout when administrators demanded that human children bow before alien authority figures. On Europa Station, Dr. Jiang Menyum refused to kneel. During medical inspections, inspiring her entire hospital staff to stand with her, the resistance wasn't limited to humans anymore. Althean traders, inspired by Zek's highest courage in the courtroom, began refusing submission rituals at spaceports across the galaxy. Krytash workers clicked their mandibles in defiance during shift changes, even some crystalline. Communes began, resonating with frequencies that translated to "we stand together." The most surprising development came from within Vorthan society itself, at Proxima University. Human exchange student Yun Jiho had been studying xenobiology alongside young Vorthan citizens. When footage of the trial reached the campus, it sparked heated debates in dormitories and lecture halls. "Why is standing upright considered rebellion?" asked a young Vorthan student named Velkeris during a philosophy seminar. "If these humans are truly inferior, why does their posture threaten our authority?" Jiho, who had grown up hearing stories of the dignity protests on Earth, helped organize discussion groups where humans and Vorthans could debate concepts like equality and respect. The meetings were small at first, held in secret to avoid detection by university security. But as word spread, even some Vorthan professors began attending. The revolution was becoming something unprecedented in galactic history. Not a violent uprising or a military conquest, but a fundamental shift in how sentient beings viewed their relationships with one another. The rigid hierarchy that had maintained Vorthan dominance for millennia was cracking. Not from external pressure, but from internal doubts on dozens of worlds, in hundreds of space stations, across thousands of starships. Beings were asking the same question that had started it all. Why should respect be something demanded through force rather than earned through actions? The standing movement had become unstoppable, spreading through the galaxy like wildfire through a dry forest, and at its center, an old Korean miner named Lihan waited in his detention cell, watching the stars through his small window and knowing that his daughter's sacrifice had finally borne fruit. The galaxy would never be the same. The third week of Lihan's trial marked the beginning of the end for 8 centuries of Vorthan domina. High Judge Velter entered his courtroom to find it nearly empty, the crystal chamber echoing within silence that spoke louder than any protest. Only a handful of beings remained in the gallery, all of them standing upright with their arms crossed. In quiet defiance, the massive blue judge stared down at the sparse crowd, his forearms trembling with barely contained rage. Security drones hovered uselessly around the chamber, their red sensor eyes scanning for targets that were no longer there. Outside, Proxima Station buzzed with activity as usual. But the flow of legal proceedings that had kept the Vorthan justice system running for generations had ground to a complete halt. "Where are the observers?" Velter demanded, his voice booming through the empty space. "Where are the legal representatives, the trade delegates?" Court Administrator Thurvel approached the judge's platform with obvious nervousness, his smaller frame dwarfed by the towering crystal walls. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "they refuse to attend proceedings that require submission protocols. The Althean Trade Council has withdrawn all representatives. The Krytash Workers' Union has declared the court system illegitimate. Even our own Vorthan legal students are questioning the necessity of the rituals." The judge's mandibles clicked in fury. But beneath the anger, something else flickered in his golden eyes. Fear, for the first time in his 40-year career. High Judge Velter was beginning to understand that his authority came not from any divine right or superior nature, but from the willingness of others to accept his dominance. In the defendant's section, Lihan sat quietly beside Park Jin-woo, the worn photograph of his daughter still clutched in his weathered hands. The old miner had lost 20 pounds during his imprisonment, but his eyes burned with the same fierce determination that had started this revolution. "Your Honor," Park Jin-woo said, Rising to address the court, I submit that these proceedings have become meaningless. Justice cannot function in isolation. It requires the participation of the community it serves, and that community has spoken clearly. They will no longer accept a system based on forced submission. The words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Velter looked along his empty courtroom, at the silent security drones, at the handful of beings who remained standing in defiance of everything he represented. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see the bustling corridors of Proxima Station, where beings from dozens of species moved about their business without the rigid hierarchies that had stiff-eyed galactic society. Reports flooding in from across Vorthan space painted a picture of complete systemic breakdown. On Kepler Station, cargo operations had resumed with mixed-species crews working side by side as equals. The Althean Traders X-High had established the first multi-species shipping cooperative, where humans, Altheans, and even some progressive Vorthans shared profits and decision-making equally. Captain Li Sujin's transport fleet had grown to include vessels from 17 different species, all operating under new protocols that treated every crew member with dignity regardless of their origin. Her ships carried more than cargo now. They carried the message of equality to every port they visited. The breaking point came when Velter's own grandson, a young Vorthan studying interspecies law at Proxima University, entered the courtroom and remained standing during the opening ceremonies. The sight of his own family rejecting the traditions he had spent his life defending finally shattered the old judge's resolve. "This court," Velter announced, his voice heavy with the weight of history, "hereby abolishes all requirements for submission-based respect protocols. Justice must be served by willing participants, not forced compliance." The declaration sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Within hours, quantum networks carried news of the decision to every corner of known space on Earth. Crowds gathered in Liberation Square, where Kim So-ra had made her final stand, celebrating the vindication of her sacrifice on distant mining colonies. Human workers wept openly as they realized their children would never have to bow before alien masters. Li Hyan walked free from Proxima Station 3 days later, but the galaxy he emerged into was fundamentally different from the one he had known. The Galactic Compact, facing pressure from dozens of member species, was forced to draft new legislation recognizing what became known as the human principle, the idea that respect must be mutual and earned, never demanded through degradation. Mining foreman Kang Dong-won, inspired by Li's example, established the first truly integrated mining operation on Asteroid Belt Station 12. Humans, Altheans, Kritash, and even some reformed Vorthans worked together under safety protocols that treated every life as equally valuable. Productivity increased by 30% within the first year, proving that cooperation was more effective than coercion. Diplomats Song Hana, who had spent years negotiating from positions of weakness, found herself at the center of drafting new interstellar civil rights laws. The legislation she helped create became the foundation for what historians would later call the Second Galactic Age, an era defined by cooperation rather than domination. Dr. Lim Yijin's research into the concept of dignity became required reading in universities across 100 worlds. Her work traced how the simple human refusal to accept arbitrary authority had spread through galactic society like a beneficial virus, transforming relationships between species that had been locked in rigid hierarchies for centuries. The most profound changes came in the courtrooms themselves. On Altair Prime, mixed-species juries deliberated cases as equals. On the crystal worlds of the Centauri system, crystalline judges resonated with harmonic frequencies that welcomed all participants as valued members of the judicial process. Even on Vorthan Prime, the Empire's homeworld, young blue-skinned lawyers began questioning the ancient protocols that had once seemed as unchangeable as the laws of physics. Lehian returned to his mining job on a small asteroid in the Outer Rim. But he wasn't the same man who had been dragged from that courtroom. Months earlier, letters arrived daily from across the galaxy, from human children who had never known submission, from Althean traders who had found their voices, from Krytash workers who clicked their mandibles in songs of freedom. The photograph of Kim So-Ra became the symbol of the revolution, reproduced on everything from spacecraft hull decorations to university textbooks. Her defiant stance in Liberation Square reminded every being that dignity was not a privilege to be granted by the powerful, but a right inherent in consciousness itself. Years later, historians would debate the exact moment when the old order died and the new one was born. Some pointed to Lee's refusal to bow, others to the empty courtroom that forced Velter's hand. But the truth was simpler and more beautiful than any single event. The revolution succeeded because it offered something the galaxy had never experienced before: the radical idea that every thinking being, regardless of species or origin, deserved to stand tall among the stars. Humanity's greatest export had never been their technology or their resources. It was the revolutionary concept that respect was earned, not demanded, and that true strength came not from forcing others to kneel, but from helping them stand up. The end.